never the one to make a dramatic entrance. I like to imagine that on the day that I was born, there was a storm raging. I like to imagine that there was a crackle of electricity in the air and that lightning split the sky, heralding in this marvelous new arrival. Of course, the reality is, I know very little about my birth, actually. I know that it was the 2nd of January. I know that that was a Saturday. And I also know it was a home birth. I suppose the other thing that I do know is that it was the first time I'd ever showed up. Now, I suppose you could argue that all newborns show up for the first time when they're born. But I mean the showing up that is actually arriving somewhere unexpectedly. For the first 6 months of my mother's pregnancy, she was told that she was just a bit overweight. And she sort of believed that, because at the age of 42, and in the day and age when having a baby at the age of 42 wasn't the done thing, she thought that could be right. There's a 6-year age gap as well between me and my next oldest sibling. And I think my parents had 2 children and kind of thought they'd done their job, duty done. And therefore, I was pretty unexpected. About a week or so, I think, after my birth, my mother sent out cards to neighbours and friends and inviting them to come along and meet the new arrival. I think they thought she'd got a dog, maybe a cat. I came as quite a surprise. But it's interesting, isn't it, when things happen to us unexpectedly, when we arrive in places unexpectedly. I think mental and physical ill health dogged my family through most of my childhood and created situations of real instability for us. At the age of 11, I find myself the sort of carer for my mother. And then eventually, in the summer of 1989, my siblings and I were orphaned. And by this time, we had kind of scattered to the 4 winds. Since then, I found myself really interested in the idea of how it is that we show up, because I felt very strongly about the need to show up, to be accountable, but also to fight back and to overcome. And through my professional career, I felt the same. Luckily, I make more strategic choices now about the times that I do that. But it's left me really interested in what is it that makes people show up? What is it that actually, at times when they are facing personal and professional situations that are unexpected, they actually stand their ground, or they come back fighting? And very importantly, how can we actually encourage young people coming through our education system to do the same thing? Now, interestingly, I don't think we have to look too far for female figures that are in the public eye that have really stood up and done something at a point where we might have taken a duvet day. Whether you support her politics or not, you cannot deny that she has been at the receiving end of public humiliation and professional loss, and all in the gaze of the public eye. The first, through the public infidelity of her husband, and the second, most recently, in the 2016 US presidential election. This is an image of Hillary Clinton during her concession speech. And when you think about the situation she found herself in, and when you also think about who she lost to, the fact that she could speak at all is all the more remarkable. Malala Yousafzai, an incredible young woman who was given the Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 17 in 2014, was campaigning for girls' rights to education when she was shot in the head by the Taliban when she was 15 years old. Now, this woman was in a situation where speaking out actually was life-threatening, and yet she chose to speak. And one of the things Malala said was, we realize the importance of our voices when we are silenced. And let's think about that a minute. Because interestingly, a lot of women find it very difficult to speak out. A lot of women are very scared of showing up. And I asked some female colleagues of mine what they thought of this idea, and one of them said to me, well, actually, yeah, women are scared to show up because when you show up, you're actually noticed. You are noticeable. You physically take up space. So actually, showing up is also about appearing and being seen. Being seen can be extremely risky. Suddenly you find yourself spouting forth to a group of people at the gaze of potential criticism, and here you are, the stage is yours, and you don't want to be found lacking. Imposter syndrome has been something that's often associated with women. In fact, interestingly, in The Guardian yesterday, there was an article about Michelle Obama, and in it she was saying how she had suffered from imposter syndrome. What's very interesting for me is that imposter syndrome affects men and women. It is not just a women thing. What's also interesting is that although more women might feel that they suffer from imposter syndrome, it's actually men who find it harder to bounce back. It's men who find it really difficult to be resilient under the pressure of feeling like an imposter. A recent research has also discovered that people who feel as though they have imposter syndrome are more likely to be perfectionists and also procrastinators. And you might think, well, how do those two things fit together? And I was thinking about this and I thought, well, it's quite obvious really, isn't it? I'm sure there have been times when, as women or as men, we have been desperate to get something perfect and right because we don't want people to think that we don't know. And yet we procrastinate for hours over something because we're scared of getting it wrong and people will think we don't know. Now, this is all about fear of failure, really. And what's interesting for me is that I have the great privilege of working with young women and men in the field of business who are trying to navigate their way through this uncertainty. And I have found that regardless of the gender, nobody wants to do anything. And the not wanting to do anything is often about a fear of getting something wrong. It would appear that the fear of doing something outweighs the fear of doing nothing. Whereas actually doing nothing is still doing something, isn't it? It's just not that useful. So part of what I'm wondering is how can we build a sense of persistence into a young generation coming through? Because this fear of failure is actually something that should concern us quite considerably. That the idea that there is a lack of resilience in young people coming through the education system is going to have real impact in what happens in the future in our world. And actually, resilience is not just about bouncing back and then carrying on with something else. Resilience for me is about persistence. And actually, we've seen this very recently with Senator Elizabeth Warren, who, in the face of unnecessary censure, persisted. And in fact, nevertheless, she persisted, has become the mantra of the women's movement in the United States. Now, whether it's a she or a he isn't actually that important to me. It's the nevertheless, you must persist. Because we need to get into a situation where our young people don't just hit an immovable impasse and stop. But what they do is they hit the impasse and they smile at this joyful challenge. And then they look at how do we get over it, under it, round it, through it, beside it. Who can I take with me that will help me do this? And one of the things we could do is look at the impact, funnily enough, of traumatic situations on people's ability to change. Now, that might seem a bit odd, and actually I would also hope that none of our young business leaders or learners of the future wind up in situations of deep trauma. But research has also discovered that when you are involved in a traumatic event, such as failure, you can actually use that as a catalyst for growth. Because our entire body network is actually hardwired to intrinsically use a difficult situation and find the best way out of it for ourselves. It's a psychological process that we go through. And it's called post-traumatic growth. So how can we encourage post-traumatic growth in our young learners? And perhaps it's about supporting them through a coaching model in their journey where we're actually saying to them, yes, it hurts, and keep going. Because ultimately, the last definition of showing up I want to leave you on is this: that showing up is actually about participating in and not just sitting back and observing your life. So if our young people are going to participate in their life, then we have to help them to unlearn that failure is a bad thing and actually learn that failure can be incredibly useful. We have to stop them worrying about not knowing and actually encourage them not to know, because developing curiosity will enable them to be excited about that joyful challenge when they hit that wall. And I'm wondering how many of us really feel that we are showing up in this way in our own lives. Thank you very much.